Jeff, let me begin just by thanking Patricia for her very thoughtful presentation. You're so deeply immersed in this subject and so knowledgeable that I learned a lot from it. And of course, I've had the privilege of working with Marlene and Jeff for quite a number of years now. So, um, my perspective has to do with someone who's been involved with research involving First Nations for several decades now, in Nova Scotia, on the east coast of Canada, more broadly in Atlantic Canada, and sometimes in the country as a whole. I began in the mid 1970s, and that involvement ended just a few years ago. And I would say that my experiences in terms of observing and participating research involving First Nations, that there have been three phases, and I'll touch on each of them briefly. My first involvement came in the mid 1970s when there was a need to collect systematic information on Mi'kmaq First Nation employment and related patterns in Nova Scotia, just because that information base was inadequate and the census wasn't doing a good job in that respect. So we proceeded in Nova Scotia in going to the 13 communities and seeking permission of chief and council in each case, and then we collected the data. When I went back to the chiefs some months later to present the results, I would say that the reaction, if not hostile, was at least suspicious. I remember thinking at the time that it was a good thing that I had a day job that I could retreat to in case my work with First Nations didn't work out. So the chiefs were asking, well, who is this guy? They'd forgotten about me entirely. Um, how did we let this information leak out to someone outside the community? And especially, how can the Department of Indian Affairs use these results against us by pointing to, for example, numbers about population in each community and arguing that the community was inflating the numbers in order to increase its per capita grants. And in fact, it took a couple of years before the chiefs were ready to release a report setting out the results. But in the end, they found the results useful enough that the organization that brought them together, the Union of Nova Scotia Indians, asked me to work with them some 5 years later to update the findings so that they would be current. So that's the first phase. The second phase, I would say, is RCAP and Canadian Institutes of Advanced Research and the kinds of things that Marlene and Jeff talked about. So I'll skip over that and go to phase three. And for me, that was the period after RCAP concluded, when my research continued and completely embodied a participatory research approach. In this phase, it was the First Nation leadership that not only consents to research, but determines what it is that needs to be investigated and what the ground rules are that govern the conduct of the enterprise, including what is done with the results. Research came to be seen as an important tool informing and giving weight to the leadership in their negotiations with government and increasingly other parties. And indeed, they've gone beyond partnering with individual researchers to establish their own research and ethics organizations, as exemplified by the Mi'kmaq Ethics Watch in this part of the country and at the national level by the First Nations um, Governance Center, First Nation Information Governance Center, with its emphasis on OCAP rules, ownership, control, access, and possession. If the work is particularly important, uh, the research team had a seat at the table with the leadership, not only to present and discuss the results, but also to give advice on its policy significance. Occasionally, one might be asked to present the results directly to a government department. So that is how I would describe phase three. And I'll conclude just by making a couple of observations about where we are. I think it's clear that the participatory research model is now the prevailing approach in the conduct of research with First Nations. It has been socialized when you think about, young researchers being trained on how to do research, um, but it's also been institutionalized in the ways that Arlene and Jeff have talked about. But some challenges remain. At the individual level, for example, not everyone is on board. And we had a situation just a few years ago where some blood samples had been collected from a First Nation as part of a national research project. They were stored in the Faculty of Medicine at my university, and some researchers, somewhat tangential to the main research project, felt at liberty to access the blood samples and do their own analysis and proceed toward publication. And that created a huge stir because it was all done without permission. There's also been some backsliding at the institutional level. Jeff and Marlene will remember there was a time around 2014 or so when the leadership at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research started to scale back the peer review process that Jeff talked about to one that was not in person and dominated by Indigenous people, but to a much more impersonal online process. There was cutbacks in funding for capacity building. The level of funding was nowhere near where it should be, given the size of the Indigenous population in Canada and the health challenges that they were facing. So we had to mount a strong national lobbying effort that all three of us were involved in, and it was part educational, but we weren't making much progress, so we had to get rough with them. That's how I describe it. And we ended up meeting with the Minister of Health, to whom CIHR reports. She was very supportive of what we were trying to do. And that led to a meeting with CIHR's governing council, which gave us a respectful hearing. And then within about 4 months, they accepted virtually all of our recommendations, including coming back to the peer review and essentially doubling the level of funding for Indigenous health research. So those are some of the issues that have arisen. The only other one I would mention is that when you're working that closely with the community, there's a tendency for some politics to come into the process, and I'm sure that's not telling you anything new. I remember meeting with a steering committee for a project that included a representative from the funding agency, and that representative was saying we could say what we said about how First Nations responded to a particular government policy edict, even though it was an accurate observation. And at other times, there are difficulties in making research public because to the extent that First Nations use them as part of strategic negotiations, uh, they're inclined to sit on the research and not give away one of their strategic advantages. So that's been my experience in 10 minutes. And I thank you for listening.